Barker was like a great athlete. He was a man about whom poems are written.
He could fly all day, he'd stay up all night. I mean, he was never tired. He was the guy that even the most accomplished of military people admired and looked up to.
Not just admired, loved by the people who flew with him.
If you had talked to Bishop and McLaren and McLeod and all of those people who knew Barker, he was their hero. Barker was the hero's hero.
A fighter pilot in World War I was signing his own death warrant. Planes were primitive. There was little training. The average life expectancy was less than 3 weeks. Yet William Barker logged more time in the air than virtually any other pilot. Billy Bishop said Barker was the greatest fighter pilot who ever lived. But Barker's prodigal talents ultimately turned against him. The arc of his glory would turn to a fall from grace that shocked an entire nation. Canada's most decorated war hero was born in Dauphin, Manitoba in 1894. Life on the frontier turned out to be good training for the future war ace.
He was a natural. If anything went wrong with the sawmill or anything, they always sent for Billy because he was a good mechanic.
The earliest picture of Barker shows him clutching a wrench, not a pacifier. He was good with horses, a crack shot with a rifle. By the time he was 12, he was winning shooting competitions at country fairs.
He never used the sights of his gun. It was what they called finger shooting. You don't use this finger as a trigger finger. Use this finger as a trigger finger. And this one points along the barrel. So you point your finger at something and pull the trigger.
In 1914, Canada followed Britain into World War I. Barker's father didn't share in his son's patriotic fervor.
He actually has a bit of an argument with his father in the kitchen and says, you know, Dad, it's my obligation to join. You know, I owe it. I owe it to my country to go.
I have examined the above-named recruit and find that he does not present any of the causes of rejection specified in the regulations for Army Medical Services. He can see at the required distance with either eye, and he declares that he is not subject to fits of any description.
We're an urban culture now, but Canada was a rural culture then, which meant that a Canadian who joined up was good with horses, good with animals, usually had a good sense of balance, physically strong. Boy, I mean, that was really good material. So these guys generally were very, very good fighting material.
Barker proved to be an outstanding recruit in the elite 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles. He was extremely adept in using one of the Army's newest and most lethal weapons. Dear Mother, well, I have some great news for you. I've been promoted to gunner on one of our 4 machine guns. I've worked hard for it and have won. On number 1 gun, I am gunner and in command under the sergeant. Ask Lloyd how he would like to be in my shoes and get a beat on some Germans.
Oh, we were great friends, and I cried and cried the day he left. The whole family went down to the train station to say goodbye to him, and I was under a couch, and my mother said, come out of there, and he said, leave her be, he said. And I was trying to figure out how in the dickens he'd ever get across all that.
Barker was one of tens of thousands of young recruits who left Canada in 1914 for the horrors of the European battlefields. Many of them would never come home. Barker was shipped to the Western Front to fight in the trenches at Ypres.
As Barker himself noted, he said, it's such a change for me from what I experienced in Christmas of 1914 to Christmas of 1915, because Barker spends the Christmas of 1915 in the trenches.
Try to imagine the trenches. I mean, you're in there for up to a couple of months, right? You're never dry. You're up to your knees in water a lot of the time. It's infested with rats. You're infested with lice. You don't sleep for ages on end. You're on a killing field that's been gone over so many times that the stench of decaying bodies is constant. You're just basically caught like a rat in a trap.
It's clear that Barker was starting to look for an alternative to almost certain death in the trenches.
For several thousand young Canadians in the what became the Canadian Corps, there was an opportunity to get out of trench warfare and do something else, to join those fellas in the air and get away from the poor blighters in the trenches. What you did was apply for transfer to the Royal Flying Corps.
Barker once claimed he made up his mind to fly watching a dogfight. He thought, I can do that, but it won't be me that gets shot down. The war in the air was largely fought over the fields of northern France. Here, near the town of Ypres, in the spring of 1916, Barker reported to No. 9 Squadron for flight training. Throughout the war, the Royal Flying Corps' main mission was to scout out and report on enemy troop movements. Each plane was manned by a pilot and a gunner observer.
The observer's job in an aircraft of 1916 was to help defend the aircraft. By that time, observers had a machine gun. Second, to take photographs for intelligence purposes. Third, to operate a wireless set in order to collaborate with artillery. You would be working with a battery of probably heavy artillery, howitzers, and other large, heavy pieces.
Well, he probably wanted to be a pilot. The glamour job was flying the airplane. It wasn't being the gunner observer and doing the photography and doing the Morse code. But Barker didn't have a choice in that. Essentially what they needed was gunner observers, and they said that's what you're going to train to be, and that's what he did. You know, you're in a situation where it's turbulent, it's noisy. You're trying to figure out where you are. You have to navigate. You have to make sure that you're not going to run out of fuel or end up so far over on the enemy side that you don't get back. And at the same time, you have to make sure that you don't get yourself shot down. I mean, you basically have to keep doing the job, even though people are trying to kill you.
Barker comes to this drenched in the Army, and he knows exactly his purpose in life as an observer is to serve the Army. And that's what makes him different from most of the young Canadians who go through and become pilots.
Dear Mother, I am booked for a 5:30 to 8 morning patrol tomorrow. I am a little uneasy, for the pilot is a brand new man, just out, and knows very little about flying and less about the country. I tell you, I'll be mighty glad when my turn observing is up and I learn to pilot myself. Barker was an outstanding observer. To some pilots, it seemed he had a death wish. He urged them to fly dangerously low for more detailed views. During the Somme offensive, Barker earned his first medal, the Military Cross, and a promotion to captain. Best of all, he was to get a shot at flying the plane. Barker amazed his flying instructors. He wasn't just good, he was a prodigy.
Within a few days, people know his name, because what happens is he goes flying with an instructor for about 50 minutes, and then he takes him up on a second trip for about 5 minutes. And then he says to Barker, well, there doesn't appear to be much more that I can teach you. And he sends him solo. Now, to put that in perspective, at that time of the war, he probably would have had 4 or 5 hours of instruction before being sent solo. But Barker goes solo in less than 1 hour. And within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, he's doing aerobatic displays in aircraft at Nether Avon.
Well, I have good news for you. I succeeded in taking my ticket today, and instead of my observer's wing, I now wear the double wings, for I'm now a pilot. I am through with this place now, and go to some aerodrome to fly faster machines.
He hopes not only to be a pilot, but he wants to be a pilot on these new generation of aircraft. And he wants to be a fighter pilot. And he doesn't get his wish right away.
Barker was reassigned back to his old observation squadron to fly the sluggish, unglamorous planes he had hoped to leave behind. The spring of 1917 was a treacherous time to be an observation pilot. It was bloody April, and German fighter squadrons were winning the Battle of the Air by a ratio of 8 to 1. Allied observer planes were referred to as Fokker fodder. In the skies over Vimy Ridge, Barker was determined to lock horns with the enemy. He flew his observer plane as if it were a fighter, strafing and harassing the Germans at every opportunity. Despite his audacity, he gained a reputation for prudence, always bringing his plane and his observer back in one piece.
It's clear that he was admired, not just admired, loved by the people who flew with him. Now, right away, you think that's a leader type. He's someone who attracts other men who are prepared to follow him in a highly lethal business. And surely there's no greater test of leadership than that.
Barker, at this point, in the summer of 1917, has over 500 hours operational flying. That's a lot of flying time in the First World War. And on the 9th of August, Barker is wounded by anti-aircraft fire. Not seriously wounded, but seriously enough wounded that perhaps the squadron commander feels, well, he needs a rest. We better send him back to England. And Barker is sent back to England to be a flying instructor, which is the last thing he wants to do.
Other air aces were becoming celebrities. There was Billy Bishop, Donald McLaren, and the Germans, Manfred von Richthofen and Hermann Goering. Barker was on the sidelines, so he decided to be the worst instructor the RFC had ever seen. Conn Smythe remembers. One day when there was an inspection, he took a plane up and flew it right through one of the hangars, in one end and out the other, buzzing some senior officers so that they had to flatten out right in the ground. When he came down, he was told, "You're under arrest." "All I want to do is go to France," he said. "You say you want volunteers? Send me." In October 1917, Barker was assigned to 28th Squadron on the French-Belgian border. He was placed in command of Sea Flight, a fighter unit of up to 6 planes, mostly piloted by novices. Seaflight's first mission was a practice patrol, strictly forbidden to engage the enemy. But Barker couldn't resist when a German formation was spotted below. Deputy Flight Commander Mitch Mitchell remembered. As they passed beneath us, Barker did a half roll and dived with the engine full on at the formation below. At about 100 yards, Barker fired on a tail-end Charlie, which instantly broke up in the air. He then led his 3 novices home at full speed. Barker was never punished for this unauthorized skirmish. The squadron quickly learned that he was a good man in a fight.
There's no need to push Barker. He pushes himself. He is self-motivated, self-propelling, and that's another sign of a real leader type. He isn't passive, he isn't quiescent. Up and be doing is his motto.
What's needed in any fighter pilot is the right mix of aggression and prudence. Because first of all, you've got to learn how to do the job. And in order to learn how to do the job, you have to survive.
And the odds of surviving a dogfight with seasoned German aces were slim. Odds that were greatly increased if a flight stuck together and fought as a team.
Barker learned that to his regret. Barker decides that he's going to take a group of pilots over and strafe Baron von Richthofen's airfield. He gets permission from the wing commander. His own squadron commander doesn't approve the mission. He gets permission from his wing commander, who knows him, who has the utmost confidence in Barker and says, if you want to go ahead and do that, go ahead and do it. So Barker asks for volunteers, and he gets pilots to volunteer to go do this mission. Well, of course, the weather's not very good, and the formation gets split up. And then what happens is they get bounced.
Barker loses sight of 2 of the 3 other planes in his flight while climbing through dense clouds. Breaking through into daylight, he and his remaining wingmen are attacked by a German formation high above. Barker instinctively swings his machine into a tight right-hand turn, losing his wingmen in the clouds. Barker now finds himself outnumbered and fighting for his life. After a desperate 15-minute battle, he manages to evade his pursuers.
But what did Barker learn out of that? Well, Barker learned that, in fact, he could get not only himself killed, he could get his wingmen killed if he didn't exercise better judgment, if he didn't exercise better prudence. So he vowed to himself that from now on, he would take better care of his wingmen.
As war raged on in France, the other front was heating up. Barker's squadron was reassigned to northern Italy. It was here, during the Battle of Caporetto, that he would make his reputation as one of the greatest fighter pilots of his generation. Ernest Hemingway described northern Italy as the picturesque front, strikingly beautiful, but hazardous to flyers, with plenty of fog and dangerous mountain air currents. Our squadron has been chosen, and we are on our way now. You know, we broke all records for a new squadron. Our losses were heavy, but we did the work. Up to date, I have destroyed 4 and driven down 3 out of control. We will probably have plenty of fighting to do. Barker's squadron was assigned to Grossa Aerodrome, a gypsy-like encampment. The planes were sheltered in canvas tents and flown from farmers' fields.
The squadron's a mixed bag of pilots. A lot of the pilots on the squadron are inexperienced. So by the standards of the squadron as a whole, Barker's a very experienced airman. The issue, however, really is he a good scout pilot? Does he fly well? Can he shoot down enemy aircraft? Can he take care of his wingmen?
On their very first mission over the Alps, Barker's flight managed to defend 2 RE-8 observation planes. He shot down 1 German fighter, bagging his 5th victory in the air. With 5 kills witnessed, Barker was now officially an ace.
Barker, to my knowledge, is certainly one of the first pilots to actually mark on his aircraft when he had a victory. So as he progressed through the war on the Sopwith Camel, he would put a little white mark on the strut.
Johnny Johnson used to say that he could tell who was going to survive and who wasn't. First day they came in, he called them the hunters and the hunted. Hunters would be checking their ammunition and they would be checking their engines. The hunted would be making sure they had enough franks and checking their parachute. And the hunted never returned. The hunted never survived, right? It's a one or the other situation. There is no neutrality here. The notches in the belt was an extension of being the hunter and promoting that mental state that would in fact enable you to survive, which was that of an aggressive state, that of the hunter.
Barker began to nurture his own pack of hunters. One of them wrote, "New pilots to his flight were lucky. Many of the survivors must owe their lives to his care. He could have cut quite a few more notches for himself had it not been for his consideration for the other pilots of his patrols." Battle after battle, Barker and his hunters waged an aggressive campaign against the enemy.
Now, there were basically two types of heroes in the First World War. There was the Albert Ball type hero. He would create a situation where the enemy couldn't shoot at him without shooting at each other. It was that old style cavalry charge type model. Bishop, on the other hand, would score most of his kills. He would sneak up on a flight, take a long time to do it. He would shoot the last guy, shoot the man, not the machine, and be out of there usually before the flight really knew what had happened. Now, to understand Barker's technique, you've got to understand the Sopwith engine. Now, the Sopwith engine was a rotary engine. Now, what that meant was you made tremendous torque to the right with that spinning and that weight around it. So in Barker's case, he would position himself in exactly the wrong position with an enemy above and behind him, which is supposed to be a death trap. Except that in this case, he would turn using the torque. He would change positions with the other plane abruptly and then shoot it down.
Where Barker perhaps differed from some people is that he was prepared to fly 365 days a year. He was prepared to fly on Christmas Day, when everyone else was happy just to lie in bed. But not Barker. Right? Barker said, well, Christmas Day is a good day to go attack the enemy. They're not going to be expecting me.
It's a lovely war. Wouldn't be a soldier, it's a shame to think.
Barker's notorious Christmas Day raid was the most controversial of his career, at odds with the likable image we get from other sources. Barker and a wingman take off in the early hours of Christmas morning. Their sneak attack on the Saint-Pierre aerodrome catches the enemy completely off guard. They then go on to attack a truck convoy and a train full of Germans on leave from the front. Barker's Christmas Day raid was immortalized by Ernest Hemingway, who wrote, "He remembered Barker coming into the mess afterwards and starting to tell about it, and how quiet it got, and then somebody saying, 'You bloody murderous bastard.'"
It seemed to me that as the war went on, it became less and less chivalrous, for good reason in a way. What's the point of letting a guy live on a point of honor when he's going to come back and kill you the next day, or kill your buddy the next day?
Apparently, his commanding officers agreed. They recommended him for a Distinguished Service Order. Back home, the farmer's son was touted as a national hero. Newspapers reported he had over 30 kills, 5 medals for gallantry, a promotion to major. Rivaling even Bishop, Barker was becoming a legend in his own time.
So we have, the gallant knight of the air issuing written challenges. Now meet you over the airport at 12:30, so that As knights of the air, they are to joust at thousands of feet over the battlefield.
October 7th, 1918. Orders have come through for me to proceed to England on the 15th of October for a rest. I sure need it. But after it, I'm going to France, and my ambition is to break all records. I've got 37 Huns down, and Major Richthofen, the German who is now dead, claims 80. I'm going to try to break this record, if my health will only hold out. Barker's determination wasn't shared by his commanders. They wanted him alive as a flight instructor, not dead as a war hero. Instead, he was assigned to run a flight school.
Barker arrives in England and he goes to RAF headquarters in London and says, well, you know, I've been away from France for quite a while, he says. He says, really, you know, it's not fair of you to ask me to take over command of a school when I've been flying in Italy for this length of time. I really should go back to France and just check things out and see how they do things, because I've been away. So someone bought that story and said, all right, fine, you can go back to France, but only for 10 days, and you can go wherever you want, you can fly with whoever you want, but you have to come back at the end of the 10 days.
The Air Force gave him a SOP with Snipe, the latest in fighter plane technology. But how many notches could he add to his belt in a mere 10 days? Barker flew to Bonatra Aerodrome, now a pasture in northern France. But luck was against him. Bad weather kept him out of the action for his entire stay. On October 27, 1918, Barker makes his final takeoff, heading back to England. There are rumors the war will end. He knows he's leaving all hope of future combat glory behind him forever. But soon after takeoff, he turns his Snipe away from England, back toward enemy lines.
And he spots a German two-seater aircraft, and he stalks the thing.
Positioning himself below and behind, Barker unleashes a volley from his twin Vickers that sends the German machine into a death spiral. He becomes distracted by the German's parachute, a momentary break in concentration. At that instant, Barker feels his Snipe shudder. He's been ambushed.
Barker's wounded, he loses control of the Snipe, and it starts to spin down out of control. And Barker regains control of the aircraft and now finds himself into the middle of large German formation.
Barker's Snipe is pummeled by enemy fire. He feels the sting of more bullets. His left elbow is blown clear off. His leg is gushing blood. Even then, he manages to shoot down 2 more fighters.
As Barker escaped from one level and descended to another, was wounded, fainted, recovered, fainted, he is in fact descending through several layers of German fighter aircraft. Now, what are they all doing there?
Barker is experiencing a new kind of aerial warfare in France. Planes flying strict formations at designated altitudes. Out of ammunition, facing death, Barker desperately tries to ram a bright red Fokker. It falls away, spinning out of control. His 4th kill of the day. Barker manages to get behind friendly lines and plunges into the Mormont forest.
One of the best yarns, flying yarns in the war, about this kind of incredible odds that this Canadian guy went up against. And to think it was a mistake. And I suppose maybe at the time everybody went, maybe every other ace, every other experienced pilot went, what a lucky idiot.
Barker's broken body was removed from the wreckage and carried to a field hospital. Soldiers who watched the aerial battle from the trenches were astonished.
The fact that he did it before this immense audience of the Canadian Corps, all 100,000 of them on the ground. There is no other VC, at least in the air, with that number of witnesses. What was Barker accomplishing for the Canadian Corps in this exploit? Well, raising its morale.
We'll make you wish you never went to war. Fight you like you never fought before. You can't beat us, can't beat us if it takes 10 million more.
William Barker was recovering in a French hospital when the war ended.
Why don't you take a tip when you know it
The downed warrior who had taken on the German Air Force was a hero. Even the progress of his surgery was the subject of news articles and photographs. Barker's final battle earned him the most coveted decoration for valor, the Victoria Cross. On hearing the news, he boasted, "By Jove, I was a foolish boy. But anyhow, I taught them a lesson. The only thing that bucks me up is to look back and see them going down in flames."
Gee, what a flyer. Took on 60 Germans. What a daring dude, was shot in the leg, the cockpit, awash with blood, his one hand gone. And thought, wow, that's the stuff. That's the stuff that heroes are made of.
He already has the Distinguished Service Order and Bar. He has a Military Cross and 2 bars. He has an Italian Silver Medal for valor. And oh, by the way, the French had given him the Croix de Guerre. But now he's faced with the realization the war is over. And of course, he's also been remembered for an event, in his own opinion, which was a bit of a mistake. He made a mistake.
Whatever his own misgivings, Barker was an international celebrity. The Victoria Cross was his calling card. He was to spend the rest of his life trying to match the triumphs of his wartime career. While in England, Barker got to know the other celebrated Canadian war ace, Billy Bishop. Together, they decided to capitalize on their fame.
So Bishop and Barker say, well, why don't we start a flying company? And they found a company in Toronto called Bishop Barker Aeroplanes. And that becomes their post-war career. They're going to make a go of aviation.
The two aces set up office in this house on Spadina Avenue, confident that air travel was the wave of the future.
In the process of doing that, Bishop now introduces Barker into his circle of friends, who are considerably more affluent and what we might call upper middle class than anything Barker's ever been exposed to in his own life.
Billy Bishop, much later in life, described the venture this way. "Such capital as Barker and I had consisted of our own resources plus all that we could coax out of the pockets of our friends. The latter monies probably regarded as charitable donations made to a couple of pleasant lunatics who sooner or later would break their fool necks and so rid their friends of further expense."
They were looking for something to do, really. That's why they formed this company, because they weren't trained for anything. They were just fucking around, really.
Barker came back to Canada and he simply did what he had done in the war. He dived into the deep end of the pool He did not want to go back to Manitoba and be a farmer. That's what his father wanted. George Barker wanted him to go home and go back to the life that he had known before the war.
What he said was he was so busy trying to get airplanes going in Toronto and trying to tell them that it's going to be the future's airplane, and people didn't believe him, you know.
Barker may have been painting too rosy a picture. Like every other startup airline in Canada at the time, Bishop Barker Airplanes was struggling to survive. And Barker had a new enemy to contend with.
See, Barker doesn't drink during the war, but after the war is over, Barker starts to drink. And Bishop's already a pretty good drinker. And the two of them become kind of like party animals. They're just blowing off steam.
Doing anything they could to keep the company afloat, Barker and Bishop resorted to stunt flying, putting on a show for the Canadian National Exhibition. They zoomed their plane so low, horses stampeded, and one woman claimed to have had a miscarriage.
And so Bishop and Barker were called on the carpet by the CNE and they were fired. And Bishop says that Barker decided to punch out the guy who was trying to fire him. And Bishop had to physically restrain Barker from hitting this guy in the chops.
Well, Barker, what he said, "You yellow little son of a bitch, where the hell were you during the war?" And my father was trying to grab him back. They were fighter pilots, wild characters. They were the epitome of a swinger.
That's the recipe for the high life. That's the recipe for the Roaring Twenties, these hysterical guys returning from war with no one to tell it to, no way to finish it, no way to work it out, because there's no such thing as psychology, really, virtually. There's no psychiatrists. So drink is a bond. They shared it in spades.
In 1921, Barker was introduced to Jean Smith, the only daughter of a Toronto millionaire. They were married at Grace Church in Toronto, attended only by the Smith family and a few friends. Barker had married well, but it wasn't always an easy fit.
And he had never had money. All he could think of was airplanes, you know. And his wife's father, I think, got kind of mad at him about that or something. I don't remember. There was a little trouble.
He's not from a well-to-do family. He's not well-educated. He has no money. It makes him suspicious automatically. And here he is, married to the only daughter of a Toronto millionaire. All he is a war hero with a bunch of medals.
Within 2 years of marriage, Bishop Barker Airplanes was bankrupt. Stung by failure, Barker retreated to what he did best.
Barker decides that he'll apply to join what is now the Canadian Air Force. And his first job actually is to go to Camp Borden, Ontario, which is north of Toronto, and take over as station commander.
Barker put his stamp on the fledgling Air Force. He pushed for the use of parachutes, developed aerial tactics, and created Canada's first aerobatic display team. These were good years, a happy marriage, a young daughter, and the kind of prestige he had enjoyed during the war. He had high hopes of being promoted first permanent director of the Canadian Air Force. But once again, Barker's superiors condemned him to run a flying school, the Air Force job he most disliked. Barker impetuously resigned from the Air Force. At this point, his life went into a tailspin. His old wounds were acting up. He started drinking heavily, perhaps haunted by memories of the war. The hero's hero was reduced to trading on his past glory, accepting favors from well-meaning friends.
Conn Smythe is trying to get this new hockey team started called the Maple Leafs. Conn Smythe says, well, what we need here is a figurehead. We need someone who's such a well-known public figure that it'll draw attention to our hockey team.
All Barker had to do was to show up to the game and give the boys a rousing pep talk. He arrived at his first game drunk and bloodied. having crashed his car into a fence.
But he got there before the game. Kind of worse for the wear and tear and a little bit torn clothes and blood. And Con Smith said afterwards he didn't know whether he motivated the boys to win the game, but he should give them something to think about drinking and driving.
A lot of these guys who were shell-shocked, they would see ghosts all the time. They were always hearing voices and seeing ghosts, and their dreams were filled with dead people coming back and people who they regarded as nicer men than them who were killed. You didn't do what you were supposed to do, which was die, like all the men you loved and admired.
By 1929, Barker was an embarrassment, drifting into obscurity. He was no longer listed in the who's who in Canada. His marriage was in serious trouble. On a cold March morning in 1930, Canada's most decorated war hero drove to Rockcliffe Air Base in Ottawa to test out a new plane. William George Barker had been one of the greatest fighter pilots of the First World War. So far, his life in peacetime was a disaster. But this day, he was happy to be doing the thing he did best. His spirits soaring as he throttled up the engine, eagerly pulling back on the stick, perhaps too eagerly, in an impatient rush to leave the earth and all his troubles far below.
My uncle said, "That's our will. That's our will, surely." And then we got the message that he had been killed.
Barker's luck had run out. Difficult aerobatics low to the ground, no room for error. Climbing too steeply, the plane stalled and crashed to the ice.
And then, in one moment, his life is ended. 35 years old, and his life's over. It's over flying a light aircraft that, was a toy. And for the men who watched that, the men who remembered him from the war, that was catastrophic. To imagine someone who was such a superstar, such a larger-than-life figure, that he could be brought down and die in this most ignominious of ways.
My mother said, well, she said, if he had to go, that's the way he would want to go.
On the day of his funeral, the entire nation mourned the loss of Canada's most decorated war hero. 50,000 spectators lined the streets of Toronto to watch the funeral procession. Air Force fighters flew overhead, dropping rose petals. There's no monument, no headstone to pay homage. The hero's hero is laid to rest in his wife's family mausoleum. The name Smith marks the entrance. A poem appeared in the Toronto Evening Telegram the day of Barker's funeral. Up to the regions of battle, where broods invisible death, on the broad white wings of morning, fanned by the winter's breath, our comrade rose light-hearted, with eyes that gazed afar, till the arrow of fate's bow struck him, and he plunged like a falling star.
In Bishop's eyes, there was nobody to match him. And Bishop said that. Bishop said there was no deadlier air fighter in aviation history. He said he'd have killed Richthofen if they'd ever fought. Like, why is he buried in a crypt with the name Smith on the door? It has something to do with the Canadian psyche that we are ill at ease with warriors. The pure, straight ahead, no nonsense, get out there and shoot and kill. That type of hero just doesn't exist in Canada. We're uneasy with it.
You have to ask the question with the First World War, why were, of the top aces, why were so many of them Canadian? The answer really was that colonials try harder because they have something to prove. Show me a Canadian that tries to do well in his selected field that doesn't feel that he has something to prove by virtue of the fact that he's Canadian, don't you?